Okay, everybody. So this is part two of the polar test videos. And if you have not watched part one, I strongly recommend that you watch part one first and go through the little exercises that I asked you to do. Because otherwise, you won't really get the full effect or maybe fully understand what my point is here. Um, when I'm talking about polar functions. So this is part two where I'm going to explain sort of, what the point of all the little exercises in part one was and what they hopefully will tell you about your polar function. But again, I had to stress, watch part one, do the exercises, or, I ask you to sort of write things out and actually do it. Don't just think about it, actually do it. Because what I'm going to be talking about in this video is explaining, what the polar functions, like how to think about polar functions. Okay. And, but before I get into that, while part one is hopefully relatively fresh in your mind. So again, do part one first. And hopefully part one is relatively fresh in your mind. Take your answers. Hopefully you still have them. And try to rank order them from what was easiest for you to do to what was the hardest for you to do for each of them. Now, with some of them, I mean, I was obviously going through each of the functions. So there were sort of 8 different things I was testing. But for some of them, um, actually, the majority of them, I was actually asking you to do, there were sort of 2 different tests, right? Or 2 different things to do. Um, so feel free to lump those together. So if, it was sort of an FI scenario, there were sort of 2 prompts that had to do with FI. Feel free to write, put those together. But in general, just try to go through each of them and come up with a rank order of what was easiest and what was hardest. And I realize that, it's going to be sort of a coin flip on a lot of them. But you should hopefully be able to identify what was the easiest for you or kind of took the least amount of effort and in some respects might have been fun to do versus the one that was like the hardest to do where it took a lot of mental energy to come up with a response. And not only that, but in each of them I tried to keep pushing you to generate more and more responses. Did those get more and more difficult, or were they, was generating 2 or 3 responses just as easy as generating 1 response? So think about it. Try to be as honest with yourself as possible. I'm sure, a lot of you are pretty well versed in this stuff. And so you probably have a pretty good idea of what your type is and probably a pretty good idea of what you think your polar function is, but try to be honest. Try to really think about how much effort you had to put into each of them. So feel free to pause the video, put some thought into it, be as honest with yourself as possible. Don't try to, find the thing that you think was like TI and you think you're TI polar. So you're going to put that as the hardest. Like, really be honest with yourself, because otherwise you don't really get much out of this. Okay. So assuming that you've done some sort of rank ordering and aren't trying to outsmart the system here, let's just sort of, quote unquote, talk about the different tests and, what they were sort of pushing on. And I also invite you to, in the comments, feel free to let me know, hey, this thing was really difficult for me, or this thing was really easy for me, or I have no idea what you were asking in such and such question or whatever. I'd love to hear feedback because this is all just stuff in my little INFJ and I mind that I've come up with. And so there's no like scientific testing or validity or reliability tests or anything here. This is all just me coming up with stuff. but I do think it will help illustrate what I think polar functions are all about. Okay. So I think of the I think of the cognitive functions is basically, you have different parts of the brain doing different things, right? You have a part of the brain doing TI things. You have a part of the brain doing TE things. You have part of the brain doing FI things and part of the brain doing FE things. Now, of course, they're all talking to each other and interacting. And, it's probably impossible to do a TE task without some sort of SE or sorry, some sort of SI or NI type input, right? So nothing is clear or, in a vacuum here. You try to focus it down as much as possible where you're relying on one function and not several. But I will fully admit that some of these tasks are probably tapping into multiple functions, so you have to sort of tease those apart. Um, However, if a TE task is also relying on some NI information, well, the same thing for the FE task. It's also relying on some NI information. And if it was easier for you to do the FE than the TE, that at least still tells you something, right? So even though they're tapping into multiple functions, if one of them was like noticeably harder than the other one, then chances are, it's a TE issue, right? Okay. So you've got these different brain parts all sort of talking to each other, but they're largely responsible for one function. And in psychology and in neuroscience, they think of attention as basically, the metaphor, the analogy is like a spotlight going off in your brain. Now, obviously, there's no spotlight in your brain, but think of it as when you have to engage in one function, let's just say TE, then the TE part of your brain, which I'm going to argue is, your executive function part, which is in your frontal lobe, then the quote unquote attentional spotlight goes on in that part of the brain. And you can actually see this in fMRI studies and in ERP studies where they put electrodes on your head and they measure brain activity. And in fMRI studies, you see blood flow, or PET studies, you see blood flow actually going to that part of the brain, right? Because, you're engaging in it. And so it takes more, oxygen and therefore more blood to go to that part of the brain. In ERP studies, you'll see more electro activity going on, right? So that's more neurons firing in different parts of the brain. So it really is possible to sort of tease these apart on a physical level. And when you see the blood flow or the electricity, increasing in a certain part of the brain, it's telling you, okay, this person is engaging this module or this underlying structure to accomplish the task, and therefore, we know that they're doing a TE thing or an FE thing, or something like that, to the extent you could parse it out. And because of that, the idea here is that the harder it is for you to engage that function, the more energy it's going to take, right? The more blood flow you need, the more electrical activity. Or it could be the opposite, where if it's sort of a polar function and you're just sort of ignoring it, you might not see as much blood flow or electrical activity there. So go, look at the studies from Dario Nardi. I'm going to do a video at some point on his findings, but the point is you see more activity in some types than others. And so getting to the polar function is the function that we all have in every personality type. It's whatever's in your seventh slot in MBTI terminology. So your second to last function in the order, the stacking of your functions. And the argument is that's what takes the most attentional resource to use to generate some sort of output, and come up with some sort of answer or solution to whatever that function's trying to do. And I would say on top of that, not only does it require a lot more attention and focus, but it manifests itself as being a very inflexible function, right? Because our brains are set up to preserve resources. Just everything in your body is trying to use as few resources as possible. And if you've got some function that requires more attentional focus, right? More blood flow or more electrical activity in that part of the brain, then your overall brain ecosystem is going to try to control how much energy it's expanding or using for that particular function. Because again, your brain is wired to not dedicate too much energy to one thing or another. Um, and so if your polar function is requiring a bunch of blood flow and a bunch of activity to get to focus attention on that brain area, then you're going to be very inflexible and you're going to come up with an answer or a response and just sort of live with it, right? And not really spend the resources digging deeper and digging deeper and digging deeper. And so when you're pushed on it, then you know, if it's your polar function, you're going to, again, come up with one response or one solution and just stick with that in general, right? Unless you're really pushed, like in part one of the video where I'm pushing you to, generate more and more responses. And you see this in the testing videos, like, talking with famous people when Eric will push on somebody's polar function. And, a lot of times, no matter what the polar function is, they are usually able to generate a response, right? Give some sort of answer. But then when pushed on it, like, well, can you give me another response? Can you give me, something else? You see this brick wall go up and they're just sort of like, well, I answered the question, what more is there to it? Right. um, and one thing that sort of prompted me is the video that I did a couple of days ago. Oh shoot, what was it on? Having a SI lapse here. But where I was talking about what frustrates the different types, right? And I was talking about what frustrates INTPs and ENTPs, and that's when they're pushed to use introverted feeling and extroverted sensing, where people are telling them what's best for them. And I gave the example of my friend who's an ENTP and how he refuses to do anything that he doesn't want to do, right? In almost this childish kind of way, right? So if he's got a boss or a teacher or just anybody who is asking him to do something that he doesn't want to do, he's just not going to do it, right? He'd rather quit and not have to do stuff that he doesn't feel like doing than just suck it up and do it. And my argument is that he's using FI to make that sort of value judgment, but it's at this very, very basic and shallow level, right? Where he makes up his mind about what he likes and what he doesn't like, and he refuses to sort of parse it out or dig any deeper, right? And the example I gave, and he's kind of a good example of this, where we all knew the smart kid in high school who got like a near perfect score on the SAT or the ACT, but they had a really hard time just passing their classes, like getting a C or whatever in their class because they didn't want to do the homework or they didn't want to do, the special project or whatever, right? So they take a big hit on their grade because they just don't see the value in doing the homework. And not only that, but you try to push it. And my mom was a teacher for several years, and she would always explain this scenario where she knew the kids were smart, and capable of doing the work, but she would try to press, like, look, just do your homework and everything will be fine. and they didn't really see the value of getting an A versus getting a C, right? And I would argue a lot of these were probably INTPs or ENTPs where, it was either polar FI or, sort of inferior FI, or, sorry, not really inferior, but A slot FI for the INTP. Um, and so they just didn't see the value of exerting the effort to get an A versus getting a C, right? And again, it's this sort of shallow FI, right? And so that's a good example for FI polar. But if you think of the other polar functions, again, you get this sort of shallow use of it, right? Because your brain doesn't want to spend too much resources on this particular function. And why that is, I don't know, right? I mean, it could be a biological thing, it could be an environmental behavioral thing, who knows? I can't explain the why behind it. I have my theories, but I can't really explain the why behind it. All we know is that, it's just harder to engage that function, so you're going to come up with a response and then just sort of leave it at that, right? So now going back to what we were doing in part one, that was sort of the point, was to hopefully show you through experience, right? Through actually doing something and trying to generate output using the various functions, of how difficult it can be, especially when you're pressed to keep going, to keep digging into that function and not just coming up with a single response, because we can all come up with a single response, even with our polar function. It's not completely missing. It just doesn't like to be pushed, right? Again, think of the ENTP smart kid in high school who's perfectly happy getting a C versus an A because they don't want to be pushed on this value issue, right? Okay. So, drum roll for those of you who, participated and are sort of wondering, okay, what was this all about? Let me just sort of walk through each of, the quote unquote tests or examples. So again, I'm really hoping that you actually exerted the energy to come up with responses here, because if you just do it in your head, you're probably not going to get the point of any of this, right? Because it's very easy to come up with answers in your head. It's much more difficult to actually have to generate a response. Because you could trick yourself into thinking, oh yeah, I came up with three or four good responses, but actually writing it out and verbalizing it is a whole different thing, right? And engaging in the SE to actually, type it out and do something. Okay. So the first thing, I asked you to come up with a list of things that, just little menial tasks that you've been putting off that you need to do. And of course, this is an SE thing where, you have to sort of get over that inertia hump and just do whatever it is that needs to be done. And, and it could be because it's just so overwhelming and you got so much stuff to do, you would just rather not do anything. Or it could be kind of like with me, where SE is the inferior function. It's like, yeah, that's only going to take me like 30 seconds to do. So I'll just wait until I have to do it. And then it'll take 30 seconds to do. And then I'll do it. Right. Like I got to respond to this email or I got to pay this bill. I'll just wait until I have to do it. Not because it's difficult or hard to do. It's just I'd rather just wait until I have to do it, and then I'll spend the resources on it, right? So coming up with the list, that is probably in some respects an SE task, but I don't think those who are SE polar are going to really have too hard of a time coming up with a list. They're probably constantly always thinking of the things they have to do. But actually, when I ask you, okay, now go do it, right? I'm gonna take a wild guess, and the INFPs and the INTPs out there were probably like, well, I'll do it after the video. I kind of want to see what this is all about, right? I don't want to actually do it. The ESTPs and the ESFPs, they probably had a hard time actually coming up with a list because they just get their stuff done. as it needs to be done. But all of us, sort of in the middle, think of, okay, how hard was it to actually initiate action to pay the bill online or water the plants or tidy up the living room or, whatever it was that you decided you needed to do. Think about how hard it was. And then I asked you to do a second one, right? So you just got done doing the first one. Now I'm asking you to do the second one. Again, think of, how relatively difficult that was compared to all the other things, right? If it was easy peasy, no problem, then SE is probably, a pretty dominant and front stack type of function for you. If it took a lot of energy to just like, oh, really, do I really need to do two things? Then we're probably talking SE being backstack or, maybe even polar. Okay. And then the next one was the SI task where I had you, think back and generate, a description of an experience you had going to the store, picking up a few items, and and I would again try to push you on as many details as possible. So, what items did you get? What was the brand name? In what order did you get them? And not only in what order did you get them, but give me the reverse order. And the reason I did that is because, like I said, if it's a polar function, it's very inflexible, right? And so if you have to come up with the reverse order, like, okay, I got that one last, and I got this one first, and all the other items in between, that's going to be very hard if you're SI polar because you have to use that information in a flexible way, right? You can't just replay, the videotape in your head and, tell me the order. You have to use that information in a flexible way and come up with a reverse order. Now, again, you might be using other functions to kind of accomplish that, but you certainly can't do it if you're SI polar, right? If you don't have just the basic information of the ordering, right? And then I asked you, details about the cashier. What was their gender? How old do you think they were? Were they younger or older than you? And what do you think their name was, right? And this wasn't necessarily trying to tap into, how good, did you look at their, you know, name on their name tag. Now, if you could remember their name from looking at their name on the name tag, then congratulations, you have very, very good SI. And that's probably, certainly front stack and, probably dominant or secondary. But just, being able to come up with what you think their name is going to sort of tell me that you can remember sort of, what they looked like, what their ethnicity was, about how old they were, because you're not going to come up with a name that doesn't really match up with, what they looked like to you. Now, yes, there's probably a little bit of NE going on there, to sort of generate a name. But again, you couldn't do it if you didn't have the SI information in the first place, right? Okay. So that was the SI. And again, think of how difficult that was for you to do, comparatively speaking, compared to the other tasks. And again, be honest with yourself. If it was something where it like took very little effort whatsoever, then again, it's probably front stack. It's probably, you know, at a conscious front stack level, and certainly not polar. Okay, then the next one, I hope I'm getting the ordering right here. The next one was I think I did the TI task next. And these were the ones where it was like, um, there is a necessary conclusion to the propositions that I'm giving you. So the first one, and I apologize if I'm getting the order wrong, just bear with me. The order doesn't really matter. So the first one I asked was, the scenario was, oh geez, it was the nuclear bomb, right? So a nuclear bomb goes off on July 1st, 2025, and Ryan Smith was born on July 30th, 2025. And I asked you to come up with some answers that are necessarily true. Just give me something, some observation or something that has to be necessarily true. Now, it's not a necessarily conclusion from the information I gave you, but just something that has to be necessarily true. And it's what, they call a priori knowledge, right? That you don't have to, nobody has to tell you, or you don't have to experience the fact, it's just something that has to be true given these two sets of conditions, right? So, and again, I'm not really looking for a specific answer, but just the fact that you can come up with any answer, right? So now one of the first obvious ones would be that the nuclear explosion happened before Ryan Smith was born, right? So the nuclear explosion happens on July 1st, 2025. Ryan Smith was born on July 30th, 2025. So it is necessarily true, a priori knowledge, that Ryan Smith was born after the nuclear explosion. Now, of course, we're ignoring all the any possibilities that the nuclear bomb set off, it restarted time, or he was reincarnated, all that kind of stuff. Let's avoid that. Let's just use, what we know to be true. So we can say, the nuclear bomb went off before he was born, or we could say he was born after the nuclear bomb. Very simple, easy peasy, a priori conclusion. But you can also say things, you can also come up with a conclusion, a priori knowledge, that Ryan Smith was not responsible for setting off the bomb, right? Because he hadn't been born yet. Again, we're avoiding things like reincarnation, all that kind of stuff. So you can conclude that Ryan Smith was, not responsible for setting off the bomb. You could also probably conclude that the nuclear bomb did not destroy humanity in total, right? It might have destroyed 99.9% of humanity, but we know that at least one human survived long enough to have a baby, at least almost a month after the nuclear bomb went off. Now, again, you could maybe make the point that, that the mother was blasted into unconscious and she was in a vegetative state, but she was at least alive enough to have the baby delivered. And chances are there were enough other people alive to help deliver the baby. So some sort of a priori conclusion. Now, again, you probably had to dip into some NI, maybe some NE here to come up with some answers, but you could not do it without TI, right? Like TI is the function that's going to tell you whether something was necessarily true with a priori knowledge. Now, again, coming up with some sort of creative answer, okay, yeah, you're using maybe another function, but you at least needed TI to be able to come up with something, right? So if you're TI polar, it was probably very, very difficult to just come up with something that was necessarily true, okay? So again, think about how difficult or how easy it was to come up with, some sort of answer to that. And hopefully the way I was explaining it made sense and I wasn't like throwing people off in that way. The next one was probably even more difficult, and probably again, just understanding what I was asking you to do might have been difficult, but if you have really strong TI, I'm hoping you were able to figure it out. So here was the prompt. Kate was the only person on earth who does not like chocolate cake. Ryan is a person and does not like chocolate cake. So, what sort of necessary sort of conclusions can we come up with? Now here I need to sort of put a pin in the point that I said necessary. And by that I meant valid, right? Because I'm going to give you two answers that actually contradict each other. So it wasn't so I was wrong in saying that they were necessarily true. but they were at least valid conclusions. So, two different conclusions. One conclusion could be that, Kate is the only person on earth who doesn't like chocolate cake, and Ryan is a person and likes chocolate cake. So maybe Ryan isn't on Earth, right? Maybe Ryan's on Mars. And so that would still be a valid conclusion because we said Kate was the only person on Earth who doesn't like chocolate cake, right? Not the only person total, the only person on Earth who doesn't like chocolate cake, right? So that's a little bit of a, sneaky thing, but, it's valid. It could be validly true, right? The other conclusion, and again, this is a little bit of a trick question, is it could be Ryan and Kate are the same person, right? Maybe Kate's last name is Ryan, and some people call her Kate, and some people call her Ryan, right? And you've got sort of an identity issue in formal logic, where if you say, okay, Kate is the only person on earth who doesn't like chocolate cake, Ryan is a person who doesn't like chocolate cake, it could be the case that Kate and Ryan are both the same people, right? So those two answers, that maybe Ryan is not on earth, or versus Ryan and Kate are the same person. Now they could, they obviously contradict each other, but they are valid conclusions you can come up with based off of the information I gave you. So now, and you might have come up with another. I mean, if you came up with another answer, feel free to put it in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And again, you're probably using a little NE in there, or maybe NI, who knows, to actually generate the response. But I would say, without TI, you couldn't do it at all. Okay. And if your TI polar was probably very difficult, if it was relatively easy and you're able to come up with a response, even if they're not the ones that I'm giving you, I'm not trying to say that these are the only responses. If you came up with other responses, great. As long as they're validly true, then, you've probably got TI front stack in, your, at a conscious level, or it's very, very high, like, fifth, sixth type slot. Okay, so that was the TI stuff. And of course, on talking with famous people, he goes through a lot of TI type tests. I was trying to avoid doing things that he does, just so that you couldn't rely on your, the fact that you've seen it before. And plus, I just don't want to, completely steal whatever he does. Okay. The next one were the set of TE tasks. And again, I want you to think of, how difficult was this, compared to the others. First one, I asked you, put together or write out instructions for putting together a piece of furniture, like a chair or a table, and do it in 6 steps. Now, if you're TE polar, like yours truly, that would be, relatively difficult to do. Now, you could probably do it, but compare it to everything else. This is all relative, right? And so compare it to all the other, tasks. How easy was it to come up with, the instructions in 6 steps? And you had to figure out what the person does first, then second, then third, then fourth, then fifth, then sixth, in that order, right? um and if you were just relying on, remembering the instructions and using your SI to remember the instructions, then okay, good for you. But I would argue, even if you did that, you would still need some TE to be able to generate the list. And then, I pushed you and said, okay, instead of 6 steps, do it in 4. And again, we're getting to, can you use this function flexibly, right? So you might have been able to generate 6 steps. And now all of a sudden I'm pushing you and saying, okay, do it in 4. And, give me a different response for the same problem. Give me a different way of tackling the same problem. Can you use this information somewhat flexibly? Now, TE was actually kind of hard to come up with an example because, number one, I'm polar. And so just, trying to figure out some flexible way of using that information was hard. But also TE is in itself sort of rigid. Like, once somebody sort of figures out a solution to a problem, usually that's kind of the solution. Um, but trying to change something from 6 steps and consolidate it into 4, I would argue, it's a TE thing where you have to be able to use that information flexibly to come up with a new answer. Okay. And if you're TE polar, that was probably pretty difficult to do because your brain figured out the response and said, haha, I've got the response for you. And now all of a sudden you have to exert even more effort to come up with a new response and solve basically the same problem but in a different way and use that information flexibly. Okay, so that's the point I'm trying to make about polar function, is that you might be able to generate a response, right, and trick everybody into thinking that you're not polar there. But when you're pushed on it and you're asked to use it in a flexible way and come up with a new response using the same information and the same goal, and try to do it in a flexible way, okay, now your brain is like, what? Right? I gave you the answer. Why am I being asked to do it in a different way? Right? So if you had difficulty on that, TE is probably on your back stack unconscious. But if it was relatively easy for you, congratulations, you probably got TE in your front stack conscious area. Okay. Then the next one was, you become the Postmaster General through some wrinkle in constitutional law. Congratulations. Now all of a sudden you have the responsibility of coming up with something, that's going to cut the budget in 10%. So again, sort of a TE, how can we make things more efficient? How can, let's look at our operations and figure out what we can do more efficiently, but still, be able to generate the output that's necessary. And I tried to force you into not flipping into some FE type response, like I'm going to build, a committee, a task force, and we're going to figure out, where all the, the wasted money is, and blah 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 blah, and again try to like punt it off into an FE type solution. Or you couldn't just go to everybody around you and ask them, give me a solution. Like you had to come up with the solution yourself. So I was trying to limit it to just TE. So for those of you where your immediate response was like, I'm going to form a committee, or I'm going to, ask the experts, then, you're probably an FE, front stack as opposed to TE. And again, I tried to keep pushing you, come up with a list of 2 things. Now give me 4 things. Now give me 6 things, right? And if you're front stack TE, you can probably just come up with lists of things all day, right? Especially the ESTJs and the ENTJs, they'll just sit there all day and come up with 100 things that you can do. But if you're, polar on TE, or if it's on your back stack unconscious, it probably got more and more difficult to come up with, additional answers, right? Again, relatively speaking, to somebody who, can use TE pretty easily. And again, it goes to the flexibility of the system. Your brain is saying, hey, I came up with, it was hard enough to come up with 2 answers. Now you're asking me to, for 4, and now you're asking me for 6. Like, screw you, right? And so if you've got that sort of sense of like, my God, like how many answers do I have to come up with? That's your brain getting frustrated. Because you're pushing on that function too much. But if it was very easy, if you're just like, yeah, I'll give you 2, I'll give you 4, I'll give you 6, I'll give you as many as you want, then, that's probably front stack and very good dominant or auxiliary TE. So hopefully you get the point there. So if you think you're an INFJ and you're kind of sort of thinking like, am I an INFJ or not? If you're able to generate answers, then you're probably not TE polar, and you're probably some other type. Okay, let's see here. Next one, our introverted feeling. So again, I apologize if I'm getting this out of order, but bear with me. So the next were questions about your introverted feeling. What do you like about your kitchen? Name 3 things. What do you dislike about your kitchen? Name 3 things. Now, even people who are FI polar could probably come up with a list. It might be harder for them to come up with a list than the other types, especially the INFPs, especially the ISFPs. ISFPs probably come up with a list of 20 to 40 things that they like and don't like about their kitchen. But if it was relatively difficult to come up with 3 things that you liked and didn't like, that should tell you something about where FI is, front stack or back stack. But I think, most people could probably come up with a list. But then, I wanted to push you on that of, okay, why? Why are there things in your kitchen that you do not like? Now tell me, why haven't you, if you said I don't like the color on the wall, right? Well, why haven't you changed it? Why haven't you painted it to a color that you do like? Or I don't like the dishwasher because it's too loud. Well, why haven't you bought a new one? Or why haven't you fixed it? Or why haven't you put the effort into changing something that you don't like? And what I'm trying to do there is trying to force you to do some sort of cost benefit value based determination, right? Or decision making, because because if there's something you don't like and you haven't put in the effort to change it or bought something to replace it or whatever, then you're making some sort of cost benefit analysis. And it could be something just as easy as it's too expensive, right? Or it could be, hey, I'm renting this place and the landlord won't let me change it, or I'm not going to spend the money on the landlord. Okay, well, why are you renting that place then? If you don't like this stuff in the kitchen, why don't you go somewhere else? But so going back to my example of the ENTPs, where I would argue it's difficult for them to register why getting an A is better for them than getting a C. They just FI don't care. Is it the same for you, right? When you're thinking about why don't I make changes to things that I don't like? Is it because you're not thinking deeply enough about it, about, what the cost and the benefit is, and you're just sort of living with it? If you're, front stack FI and a real, heavy FI user, chances are, you're not probably going to put up with things that you don't like. And if you do, you probably have a reason for it, like a real reason that you've thought about, right? And you've done some sort of cost benefit analysis of why you're willing to put up with things that you don't like in your kitchen. Now, if you're an INFP and you're SE polar, it might be just sort of the bane of the INFP, where you just lack the initiative to actually make the change that you want to make, right? Like to paint the walls or go out and get the new dishwasher or whatever. But for whatever reason, you're making some sort of cost benefit decision. If you're FI polar, I would argue that's probably a little bit more difficult to come up with an answer, to come up with, okay, why am I willing to put up with this? Other than just sort of a shallow, simplistic answer like, well, I just don't feel like spending the money. Well, why not? Why will you spend the money on other things, but you won't spend the money on this? Like, can you give me a reason? And chances are, if you're FI polar, you're just, I'm fine with it, and I really don't feel like parsing out why, I'm willing to put up with it. Okay. Next one was, again, an FI task. tell me 3 songs or books or movies that you like that you don't think your boyfriend or girlfriend, significant other, or somebody close to you doesn't like. And this is, again, an FI thing, trying to figure out, like, not only what do you like, but what do other people like? Being able to register what other people like. And yeah, there's some FE part of that, but I would say, putting your FI into, or putting yourself into somebody else's shoes and reading their FI is very similar to just reading your own FI, right? Like, if you don't have your own FI, it's going to be very hard to understand what somebody else's FI is, right? So let's see here. So being able to, come up with responses, yeah, we could probably all come up with responses, but then I sort of pushed you on it. Oh, okay, well, give me a reason why, you think that they won't like it, right? And hopefully you're able to, generate something a little deeper than, they just don't like the music I like, or, I like rock music and they don't like rock music. Hopefully it was a little bit of more of a deeper, like, reason why you like it and they don't like it. And that could be hard. I mean, even, I'm backstack FI, it's sitting there in my 6th spot. And it was actually kind of hard, even for me to kind of come up with an explanation. But I'm assuming if you're front stack FI, it's probably a little easier for you to sort of parse that out, like why they like it or don't like it and you do, right? Some sort of reasoning. Again, you're probably tapping into a little bit of NI, maybe a little bit of NE, maybe a little bit of SI. They told you at one point why they like it or why they don't like it, and that's fine. But again, I'd argue without FI, you wouldn't be able to do it at all. Okay. And then I asked you, can you convince them to like it or not like it? Now, this is a little bit of a trick, because it's a little bit of FE and a little bit of FI, right? Because FE is, your social interactions, interacting with people. And now you've got sort of a goal, right? Can you convince them to like what you like? But it's also got an FI component to it. So again, it's a little bit of a trick question. This is when I'm interested in seeing what people's responses are, because did you sort of take an FE approach, to the issue, where it's more about trying to convince them, as opposed to more of an FI approach, where it's more about trying to make your personal case, right? Like, this is such a great movie because the acting was so great, or the directing, or the cinematography. Like, how could you not like this movie? It's so great, FI kind of stuff, as opposed to an more FE approach. Like, I really thought you liked Martin Scorsese movies or whatever. Like, what is it about this movie that you don't like? Or I thought you liked, rock music or whatever. What is it about this one that you don't, where you're trying to get them to generate and think about it, as opposed to just like, my God, it's so fucking great. Like, how can anybody not like this movie? Which would be more sort of an FI kind of approach, right? So a little bit of a trick there, where it kind of depends on how you approach the situation, whether you did it FI or FE. So I'd be interested in thinking of, or hearing what your responses were. And again, this is why I wanted you to write it down, because I didn't want you to, I don't want you to rethink it and recreate history and give me, sort of a different response than what your original response was. And maybe you tried both, right? Maybe you're an INFP and you're pretty good at both FI and FE. So I'd be interested in hearing. Okay. And then the next one was the question of, you owe your friend $100. You don't have the money. You're supposed to pay them tomorrow. This is very open-ended. Like, I'm not looking for any specific type of answer. But again, it's like, I'm going to just keep pushing you on it, right? So again, even if you're FE polar, right? So this is a FE type question, right? You got to navigate the social world and come up with some sort of answer. Again, you could be tapping into NI, tapping into SI to come up with your answer, but it is a very FE, it's very much grounded in FE. Um, and so it could be, you whatever answer you came up with, I think anybody could come up with at least one answer, right? Even if you're FI polar, and it could be just as easy as like, well, I'm just going to ignore them for a week, and wait for them to come to me, and hopefully I'll have the money in a week. Or it could be, I'll ask somebody else if I could borrow the money, or maybe I'll go sell something real quick online, whatever, you came up with. But again, I wanted to push you, come up with one answer. Now come up with a separate answer. Maybe the first one's not going to work. So you got to come up with a second one, and now come up with a third one. And again, it's, can you use that flexibly? Can you come up with different responses given the same scenario? Can you come up with a different way tackling the problem? If plan A doesn't work, do you have a plan B? That kind of thing. And I would argue, if you're FI polar or FI sitting in your back stack, yes, maybe you could come up with it, but how easy was it, relatively speaking, to everything else, and relatively speaking to people who are front stack FE? Front stack FE, if you're an ESFJ or an ENFJ, you could probably come up with 10 to 20 things that you could tell this person, or deal with the situation, to either come up with $100 or to convince this person to give you more time, or, however they're going to come up with the solution. But they can come up with a lot versus somebody who's like, oh, I got plan A and maybe I got plan B, and they better work. If not, I'm screwed. Um, that would be more FI polar, FI in the back stack, most likely. Again, not to say you can't do it. It's just how much energy, how much effort did it take to come up with the responses compared to the other functions, the other tasks, and also compared to other people. Could you generate 10 items just off the top of your head without even thinking about it? Okay. Um, Then let's see. So those are the feeling ones. Then we went to intuition. So the first one, and full credit to Talking with Famous People. I'm totally biting off his NI questions, but I like them, and I think um, they get at the heart of it. But I, wanted to do it with a little bit, again, putting more pressure on. So I asked, come up with the definition of being enlightened or enlightenment. And, you probably have some sort of definition of what it means to be enlightened. But I would say, you got to sort of tap into your NI. Um, yeah, to come up with sort of something that describes the essence of enlightenment. There might be better examples, but I think enlightened is a pretty good one. You have to understand sort of the essence of what it is to be enlightened. Now, if you're a heavy SI user and polar on NI, chances are you're just going to come up with what you think the dictionary definition is, that you've sort of stumbled across. And if you Googled it, then you're definitely NI polar, to come up with a definition. Um, all you ESTJs and ESFJs out there Googling, cheating, and coming up with it. Okay, so, but then I wanted to press you on it and see, again, can you use this information flexibly? Or can you use this processing system in a flexible way? And give me what you think the definition that a Catholic bishop would give for enlightenment, which might be different than yours, right? And so now you have to sort of put yourself in their perspective, just like I was talking about with FI. Can you put yourself in somebody else's perspective? Now you have to, put yourself in the shoes of the Catholic bishop, and what would they think enlightened it means, and what did they think the essence of it is? And there's some people describe NI as sort of this perspective, being able to see different perspectives, either the perspective of a different person, or maybe a perspective, in space or whatever. But being able to see things, in different perspectives, right? In different ways. Um, so can you put yourself into the perspective of a Catholic bishop, or can you put yourself in the perspective of somebody who is in China or of Chinese descent? And if you are Chinese, somebody who's German or some other perspective. Because then again, you're using this information a little bit more flexibly, um, and and not just coming up with an answer like an SI answer where somebody along the way gave me this definition and I'm just going to regurgitate what I heard. You like actually have to think about it, right? In this deep, flexible way to come up with somebody else's perspective. Um, and again, maybe everybody could do this, no problem, but it's all about how much effort did it take. And if you're NI dumb or if, it's in your front stack, it probably didn't take you a whole lot of effort. And it was probably relatively easy to put yourself in somebody else's perspective and come up with an answer. Same thing for the word justice, so how do you define justice? How would a Catholic bishop define justice? And how would a cowboy define justice? And again, if you're NI polar or NI is on the back stack, you might have to think about like, okay, I saw this movie one time and this is how they sort of define justice, or I saw, some Catholic mass or something, and this is how the priest was talking about justice, where you're relying more on experience than what you think instead of an intuition, like what you would intuit a cowboy would think of as justice, or what you would intuit a bishop would. So, a little hard to articulate. Hopefully, you get the point. But when you're coming up with your answer, if you're relying on, just the textbook dictionary definition, or hey, I saw some movie or I saw some person interview that sort of fills that cowboy role or Catholic priest role, and this is what they said or what I think they would say, that's probably a little bit more SI based answer. But if you can just sort of use that information flexibly about, and then like what about the world, what about cowboys, what about Catholic bishops or people in China, then that's probably a more flexible use and probably more front stack, right? So think about what was going through your head when you're trying to generate the answer. And now the NE one, which is probably one of my favorites. I love the NE tests because I just I love NE stuff. And so this was the one where you're supposed to come up with a story and an explanation of to sort of flesh out the story, right? So the prompt that I gave you was Kate moves into a new apartment and her dog refuses to go into one of the rooms in this new apartment. Okay. And you're allowed to come up with whatever story you want. And one of the funny things that I've noticed before I get into this, one of the funny things I've noticed in the typing videos is when somebody's confronted with one of these sort of any things like, give me a story. And if they're any polar or they, sort of backstack unconscious NE, then, they sort of give an answer about like what they think the person asking wants to hear, right? Like that there's a correct answer, right? Or they'll come up with an answer that's sort of, you can tell it's sort of based on like a book they read or a movie they saw, like something that they experienced. And they're just like, yeah, but they do it in this very rigid kind of way where they think there is a right answer and almost refuse to accept the fact that like you can give any answer, like any answer in the universe, just come up with something, right? Just give me some sort of explanation. And it seems sort of difficult for them to understand, that they have that freedom, right? That they have the ability to just come up with anything. and that like it's almost like they think there's like a specific like right, like it's a trick question and there's like a right answer to it. That's just my take on it. I don't know if that's necessarily what they're thinking, but it's sort of how they come across, especially when they're anypolar. So with this, again, I wanted to see how flexible your NE is. Not only can you come up with one scenario, can you come up with two? Can you come up with three? Can you come up with four, where they are all completely different, right? So the first one you might have thought of, okay, there's something metaphysical going on, and there's a ghost in the room, and the dog refuses to go in there because the dog knows there's a ghost in the room. Okay, great. Perfectly good NE explanation. Now give me something else that isn't a ghost and isn't like a vampire or something else like metaphysical. And so then maybe it's like, okay, there's a cat in the room or a squirrel got in and the dog is afraid of whatever the cat or the squirrel is. Okay, that's a little different, but it's still sort of like they're scared of something, right? Give me something even more, right? And so it could be, the dog has no legs and there's stair and you need to walk upstairs to get into the room. You know, like any explanation is good. Or, and really getting into it, it could be, the dog is actually a secret FBI or CIA agent and it spotted an assassin waiting for them across the street, and there's like a sniper in the other building and they're just waiting for that dog to go into the room to take him out, right? Any explanation, but can you come up with something that's sort of different from the other versions, right? And the only reason I was able to come up with those is because I've been thinking about this, right? So I didn't just come up with those on the spot. So but for like the ENTPs and the ENFPs, again, they could probably just go all day and give you hundreds of different scenarios of why that dog won't go into the room, right? Because they're very, very flexible in E, and they can think of different possibilities and different ways of framing the issue or framing the question, and just generate a million responses. If you're any polar, you probably came up with one response and you're sticking with that response. Like, that's my story. Okay, give me another story. And you might have been able to come up with a response, but instead of a ghost being in the room, there's like a vampire in the room, or some other metaphysical creature, and so like you're not expanding the boundaries as much as somebody who's front stack, dominant NE. Um, and so think about it. Like, look at your responses and how similar to each other are they, right? So it's not necessarily could you come up with four responses. I think everybody, even any pollers, probably could come up with four responses, but how similar are they to each other? Is it sort of like kind of the same reason, but in a different form? Or are they just like all over the place? Like, the dog's a CIA agent and there's an assassin waiting across the street, that kind of thing. Or it's just like a completely different movie, right? Or a completely different story. All right. So that is sort of the essence of what these polar tests were trying to accomplish. Again, it's all relative, in two ways. It's how easy was it compared to the other tasks, right? Was the TE one like you know noticeably different, more difficult to do than the FE one? Was it harder for you to come up with instructions on how to put together a chair than to come up with four or five ways to deal with the fact that you owe somebody $100 and you don't have the money, right? Can you figure out a solution to that easier than coming up with the instructions, or vice versa, right? So is FE harder or TE harder, comparing the two? Um, and then not only that, but just sort of think of somebody where they're able to do it with little to no effort, right? So the ENTP and the ENFPs could probably come up with 100 different stories about why this dog won't go into the room, right? They are completely unfettered when it comes to coming up with various different possibilities. And not only that, but like each scenario is probably as different as possible as you can think, as from each other, right? So again, this is all relative, and it's never and nothing, there are no absolutes. And nothing is to say that, even if you're polar in a particular function, that you cannot do it. And a lot of people, when they're talking about polar functions and blind spots and tricksters and all that, they tend to shorthand it and sort of fall into the trap of being like, this is the function that you can't do, or this is the function that, you're just sort of blind to and act as if it's not there. And maybe in some cases that's true, but I'd argue, it's there, it's just not very flexible. And not only that, but when you push on it and try to get more than just one response using that function, it gets more and more difficult to do. Relatively speaking, compare it to your other functions, right? So if you think you're, SI polar, compare how easy it was for you to do the SI task versus the SE task, vice versa, that kind of stuff. Or how easy was it for you to do the SI task versus the NI task? Those sorts of questions. So that's why it was important to actually do it, because you had to force your brain to come up with a response and not just think about it. And for those of you who didn't actually generate a response, I'd ask you, in some ways it's been spoiled, but maybe give it a try, and actually try to come up with responses, even though the cat's sort of out of the bag here, but and at least try to come up with responses that are different than the examples that I gave. And really test yourself to figure out, how much energy did it take to exert here. Okay. I think that's about it. I'm sure I'll have more to say about it, but again, polar functions is like, if you want to understand different personalities and how all the different types differ from each other, polar functions is like the thing to zero in on, and everything else sort of falls into place after you figured out what the polar function is. Okay. Hope this helps, and feel free to leave comments. Interested in hearing, especially if you have examples of any responses or anything. I'd be interested in hearing them, especially that FI versus FE one, the one about like, how do you convince somebody, to like a song or a movie or a book that you like that they don't like. Okay. Talk to you next time. Enjoy your weekend or whatever day it is. Bye.